Welcome, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Mayuri Wijayasundara. She's also a CPA and a member of the management accounting body from UK, CIMA. I'll talk a little bit about her in a minute, but before that, some ground rules for the seminar. You will not have your voice enabled. You can't talk, but and also the Q&A box, sorry, the chat box is not available. But you can ask any question on the Q&A box, and we will essentially answer those questions at the end of the seminar. So there'll be some time for us to take questions and also answer them. Other than that, there's no other ground rules, I think. So let me now get on to introducing Mayuri. She's an expert in strategy and transformation, specializing in enabling transition to a circular economy. Now we'll find out what a circular economy is, and it is, I think, crucial that we know about this and what we have to do ourselves in this area. She's obtained a PhD from the University of Melbourne and is a chartered management accountant of CIMA, as I told you. She worked as a senior management leading transformative projects during her corporate career. She had a very big corporate career before she joined academia in resource recovery and building material industries. She was leading a research group in the circular economy as a tenured academic at Deakin University till the end of 2021, where she's left now and joined a firm that is specializing in this area. Okay, so she's currently works as director for Anvata, a management consulting company providing insights, consulting and services and solutions. So over to you, Mayuri, and thank you very much for agreeing to give this very important talk.
Thank you, Janek. Thank you for that generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here, and I'll share my screen and perhaps start the presentation. So let me share the screen with you. All right, I hope all of you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Yes. Alrighty, so the presentation today is about circular economy and our role as management accountants in light of transition to a circular economy in general. So I thought it would be good to divide into three parts for completely newbies to what a circular economy is about. There's an introduction to circular economy and the integrated concepts. And the second part is about a framework that helps us simplify the steps to transition to a circular economy. And the third part is where we talk about a few more areas in depth about how management accounting profession is basically it needs change, or where there are some of the practice areas that need development when we make this transition to a circular economy. So I'll probably go one after the other and get started. So starting with what a circular economy is about. The easiest way, I think, to explain what a circular economy is to sort of define and interpret about in the current economic system we are in. So economy is like a very broad word, but if we try to simplify it by understanding the three key processes associated with it, one is production, the second is distribution, and the other is consumption. So our economy, the current economy that we are in, it's arranged where these processes come in a line. So it's arranged in a linear fashion. So the way it is organized right now, we have a increased reliance or dependency on natural resources. To produce, we need to extract resources from nature, the natural environment. We produce, we distribute, we consume, and then at the end we have waste. So at the beginning of the start of the economic processes, as well as the end of the processes, and also in the middle where we have emissions, there's a degenerative effect on the environment. So combining this with the scale of manufacturing that goes on, which is coming from the industrial era. So we are now in an extractive, degenerative industrial model, which means when we perform economic activity, which means produce, distribute, and consume, we have a degenerating effect on the environment. And the alternative model is what we call a circular economy. It's a regenerative industrial model that circulates nutrients. So I'll talk more about how this can be done. But if we go to the core principle, the idea is to organize the production, distribution, and consumption processes so that the resources, rather than having a dependency on the natural environment to extract resources, we will have some extraction, but at the same time, the economic activities and the material flows are organized in a manner that the post-consumption as well as during following production as well as distribution, the resources can be regenerated, retrieved and regenerated to the economic system. So that's what we call as the to-be system or the circular economy. Trying to define it. So this is like one of the common definitions adopted by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So it's an alternative economic model that focuses on regeneration of products, components, and materials to the highest utility and value. So why do we talk about not just products, but a sort of a higher detail of a product going into components and materials? So when we try to think of the system that regenerates it, I mean, in a typical linear economy, we can end up or rather sort of limit to talking about the product. But in a circular economy, we are going a few levels in depth to think about what are the products constituting of. They're made of components, and each component is made of materials. And we need to think at that level of depth, in order for this model to work. So what you see on the right side is a watch, which has multiple components, and the components are made of different materials. So in a circular economy, we think of that level of detail when we think of regeneration. Going to the next slide. So where did it start? What we generally call today as circular economy, the concept basically was has its foundation based on a principle called cradle to cradle. So this basically was talked about in the last perhaps 3 decades, but I think in the last decade or so, it has got wide international attention, as well as it has become a global buzzword when we talk about sustainability. So the initial founders, Michael Braungart, who's a German chemist, and William McDonough, who's an American architect, they challenged the principle of sustainability by telling that it's not enough to think of negating the effect on the environment. What we are trying to do is to do damage to the environment and trying to bring it back to zero. Trying to make it back to zero. But bringing it back to zero or negating is not good enough. So there's this common phrase that they, which is very closely associated with their cradle to cradle principle, which is less bad is not good or not good enough. So they talked about a way that we need to redefine the economic system, where we should not just apologize for human footprint, but we rather celebrate human footprint, which means the model is such that every time we have economic activity, rather than thinking that we damage the environment, we should be able to celebrate it by creating endless cycles of resources and creating sort of a nice dynamic equilibrium with nature, where resources flow regenerating the environment. So how is this done? Is by identifying 2 distinct cycles where materials can run. So the first cycle is called the biological cycle, where whatever the materials, products, and components going into that cycle are designed to regenerate, interacting with nature. And the other cycle is called the technical cycle, where the products, components, and materials going into that cycle is designed to interact with the industrial environment, and they are designed to regenerate proactively. So the idea is to design materials, products, and components before they are produced, so that they are diverted to these 2 distinct cycles and are designed to regenerate. So that is how the I would say the ideal circular economy functions, and the ultimate system then generates no waste. So let's see how easy and difficult to do this. So this is the strategic framework that is proposed by Cradle to Cradle. Biological cycle, you can employ basically 2 strategies, and on the industrial side, on the part of the industrial cycle, you can employ approximately 8 basic strategies. Some of them might product level, some of them might component level, some of them might material level. So I thought I'll explain it using an example, how this works. So I'm taking the example of getting the services for washing from a washing machine. So in a linear economy, we think of, if you want to wash our clothes, we think of purchasing a washing machine. We use it. When it reaches its end of life, we dispose of it. In a circular economy, we think about it differently. When we want to wash clothes, we question what is the fundamental human need that we want to address through washing clothes. So address to buying a washing machine, which is washing clothes. So to wash clothes, what are the ways that you can manage the product within the economy? So the first 4 strategies are about managing a washing machine as a product. So you can get access to a washing machine through communal access or subscription. The second one is that rather than purchasing the washing machine, you can purchase the services of a washing machine. You can gain access to the product by paying per cycle per wash rather than owning the washing machine, in which case the product will be continually used, serviced, and maintained. And then you can think of having a washing machine. At the end of its life, you can sell it secondhand, or you can buy a pre-used. So you have a secondary life cycle for a washing machine purchased. Fourth one is you have the repair associated with the product, in which case it can be longer in use as a product. Number 5 and 6 are associated with components. So if you design the washing machine to disassemble, and once it's disassembled, it's ready to be recycled at material and component level. If there are some components which have worn out, it can be refurbished or remanufactured. So in which case, you just remanufacture that specific component and keep the other components which can service longer in use. The next level is the material level. So you upcycle or recycle a product. Now, upcycle is where you identify a specific use of a material and design accordingly. So, for example, if you have the lid of the washing machine and you want it to be the lid of the next cycle of a new washing machine, you manufacture it that way, and at the same time you retrieve it carefully with a certain degree of purity that you can use it as a lid of the next washing machine. So it's upcycling is when you identify a high value specific use from the start and design the material accordingly, and recycle is when you recycle the materials as a commodity. So if you think of once again the compared to the current options that we use to purchase a washing machine and dispose of it, all these are sort of possible options that you can have within a circular economy to wash clothes. And it doesn't necessarily need purchasing a washing machine. Alrighty, I thought I'll give a sort of a brief intro to some of the other concepts and principles associated with circular economy, simply because I think there are maybe sustainability professionals who might try to sort of figure out where the principles of circular economy fit within the general picture of sustainability. So our focus currently now is a lot on decarbonizing the economy, which is having a low carbon economy where we try to achieve the same level of economic output with less carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. Another concept is a dematerialized economy where we try to achieve the same level of economic output with less resources. Another one is performance economy, where we have where we try to optimize the performance of the products. So the core principle, or the key principle associated with circular economy is regenerating nutrients. And in doing so, it also basically goes, the strategic framework and everything that goes around designing the principles are also catering to all the other ones here as well, which means we don't want to regenerate at the expense of carbon emissions. We don't want to regenerate at the expense of having more material or resources. So circular economy is a regenerative economy, focuses on regeneration, but at the same time, these economic principles are not compromised, or rather they are promoted. Because it's sort of it has become a common buzzword. It's often misunderstood. So I thought I'll sort of quickly summarize what it is about once again. A circular economy is about designing the system to be regenerative proactively. And it's about distributing and retrieving goods consciously to provide the optimum performance of resources. And it's to be able to recover the nutrients following consumption with a maximum degree of purity, because we don't want to have non-value adding recovery and recycling processes to recover the materials back. What it is not, it's not about trying to reinstate a material to the same condition. So if we don't design it in advance, and if we have waste generated and then we try to deal with waste and retrieve back waste, consuming a lot of energy and resources, and to have the material coming as a closed loop material, that is not what circular economy is about. It's not about just recycling materials. I mean, you saw in the strategic framework, it's the 8th strategic priority. There are many more things to be done before designing a system to completely recycle a material. Then it's not just collecting and repurposing waste. Ideally, a circular economy shouldn't generate waste, but our current linear economy does generate waste. But what we need to understand is that if it generates waste, it's a suboptimally designed system. You need to recover the resources from the existing waste materials, but at the same time, the ultimate vision should be to transfer to a regenerative system. Alrighty, so that's the brief snapshot about circular economy, and I think I'll move on to the next part of introducing the sort of the framework for transition. I go ahead. Yeah. So in thinking about transition, I mean, it's a sort of a whole big system that we are talking about. It's the economy, the global economy. And I like to have this quote, which I really like. It's from Buckminster Fuller. He says that you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So when we think of a circular economy, if you try to sort of apply what he says, transition to a circular economy then is like repairing an engine when the engine is running, which seems an impossible task. But if you try to think of it from a more sort of a more simple or a micro point of view, we are trying to transition to a new system. So what we need to do is to think of the system and identify the system constituting of different parts, and we need to substitute some of the parts with new different alternatives. And by doing that, we kind of automatically transfer into a new system. So this is the way I sort of approach transition to a circular economy. It is something, I mean, the current system we have is something like this. We have why we can't run it for too long is that we have increased reliance on natural resources. Earth has its limits for natural resources. We are limited by the finite availability of natural resources on Earth. And on the other hand, if we keep on generating waste, we create environmental liabilities, and the accountability for corporates for the impact their products create is becoming more and more. So that creates risks on the business from the supply side as well as the market side. So if you think our current system is something similar, what we're trying to do is to enable it through replacing it with different alternatives and having a smooth run such as this. So the framework that I like to share with you is something that I'm sort of planning to publish, where I thought it's easy to elaborate it using sort of 4 different steps. So the first step is basically to develop alternatives. So developing alternatives is sometimes would involve or rather most of the times would involve technology and research and development, because we're talking about new products, new components, new materials. And there's also a part where there's alternative supply chains and business models, or new way a value chain is organized, a new distribution system, where a lot of us actually do deal with. The second part is to evaluate them with the current practice and make choices. So this is where management accountants' role become very, very important. So the decisions could be industry and business decisions, as well as public policy and decisions involving public sector, which needs additional dimensions such as benefit to society that needs to be taken into account. The third one is to redesign and operationalize. So if you have the new system simulated and developed, you then need to think of it as a transformation. So we then have the challenges that are usually associated with transformation. Why do communicating to people, educating to people, making sure that they have enough reasons to uptake a sort of a new alternative, creating incentives and disincentives, and understand the risks associated with transfers or transformation. So this is the part that we sort of deal with, that part of management. The last part is we just can't basically push solutions. We need to create a pool. And typically for corporates, those who create pool are consumers and buyers. So buyers could be industrial buyers or consumers. There are new choices of consumption that needs to be introduced, and there's need to have there's a need to understand buyer and consumer behavior more and more, and plan to tackle some of the challenges in advance. So this is, I mean, if you think of transition as a system, a systematic transition, some of these components actually play a vital role. So I'll probably focus the rest of the presentation a lot on the second part, but I'll also talk about the other ones a bit more in detail in the next part. Alrighty, we are going to the third part. I think we are on time so far. I'll get started with the third one, which is about how this influences management accounting practice and what are some of the things to be to get ready for. All right, the first aspect that I thought, so it's actually the content in this area is quite substantial. I'm actually developing a course on this. So I've selected 4 areas that I could talk with you, share in this presentation. The first area is how it influences transactions and economic exchange. So coming from the financial professional side or management accounting professional side, there's something that we need to understand when we talk about a linear economy. So something really fundamental, I think I briefly explained this to you before. In a linear economy, we are thinking of producing products and selling the product. So if you think from a scientific perspective, when we produce a product and sell a product, the custodianship of the product is transferred from the buyer to the seller. Sorry, from the buyer to the consumer. What goes from buyer to the consumer from a scientific perspective is a set of resources. That resources are in the form of product, which consist of components and materials. By selling the product from by transferring the product from the seller to the consumer, we also if it is done without any sort of tracking of where the product goes, we also disconnect the information chain on products, components, and materials in the product. So in the linear economy, we buy, consume, and throw away the product, and then at the time of purchase, the information chain is disconnected, and definitely when the consumer throws away the product becomes completely untrackable. So in a circular economy, the way that we want to create that connection is through having extended producer responsibility for the product and what we call product stewardship, which means if we think of, once again, what does the product serve? It fulfills a fundamental human need. And what's the best way for a consumer to fulfill this need is, do we need to actually transfer the product, ownership of the product from the seller to the consumer? Can we transfer access to the product, access of the product, rather than having the consumer own the product, in which case we still contain control of the product and gain the ability to retrieve, replace, or repair the components and materials of the product. So this concept is increasingly practiced in a circular economy. And this is an area where there's a lot of financial accounting principles need to be redefined or redesigned for this to sort of function on a day-to-day basis. So this is an example from Europe. In Netherlands, there's the example where Philips, a famous electronics company who sells not light bulbs, but lights as a service. There's a quote from Thomas Rau, who was the designer in the project. This is sort of what he thinks, how the consumer thinks. I told Philips, listen, I need so many hours of light in my premises every year. If you think you need a lamp or electricity or whatever, that's fine. But I want nothing to do with it. I'm not interested in the product, just the performance. I want to buy light and nothing else. So this is, if you think of it from the consumer's perspective, there are increasingly new business models emerging in this area where we are not thinking about selling products, but rather having product service systems. And in some of those systems, the seller keeps the ownership of the product. And in some of the system, the user keeps the ownership, but then repair and keeping the product longer in use is supplemented through providing of repair services. So one example is if you can sell the performance aspect of the product, where the customer is billed per performance. For example, for lights, the customer can be billed for area illuminated, where the seller keeps the ownership of the product. The customer can be billed for number of hours of switch on cycles. So in the example of a washing machine, it could be number of washes. Use oriented is where we keep where we let the customer keep the product for a certain length of time. So this is happening also currently with electronic equipment like laptops or even mobile phones, and it's hired, but still the ownership is with the seller. And the last one is where the user keeps the ownership, but the seller sells it with repair services. So with this type of services, we can think of some of the products that we use. The way that they're being sold is getting redefined. Now, for example, if you think of I took the example of a light bulb and a washing machine. If you think of something like mirrors, I mean, what a consumer ideally intends to buy is a reflective image of like themselves. So there are ways to sort of define the service expected from the product separately, and then design relevant business models. So that's an area that is changing with the emergence of circular economy. All right, I'll go to my second example. So here I thought I'll talk about how the current, a lot of the corporates currently have their vision, probably key sustainability and corporate aims designed in a certain way. So I'll probably share my views about where it stands in the emergence of circular economy. So generally, corporates have a vision of where they want to be. They have targets. They have a mission statement where they say this is how we are going to achieve it. And when you think of sustainability performance, the business performance and sustainability performance sometimes in a lot of corporates currently have two different targets. And the sustainability performance, some of the corporates have a medium to long-term target to be carbon neutral. And when we think of where they could be actually, there's a, I mean, I love this diagram, and I used to explain, I like to use this to explain of what they actually should be setting as a vision. So this is from Reed, who basically defines what are the stage of sustainable development, or what are the stages of that a typical corporate needs to think of on the stage where they are. So if we have the conventional practice going on to avoid legal actions, we probably, I mean, that is being done to avoid legal actions. Having a set of relative improvements can be called green. And you reach the point of where you call sustainable, which is a neutral point. And when it comes to then the impact a corporate could have on the environment, there are two sides to it. One side is the energy footprint, and the other side is the resource footprint. So the carbon neutrality is a status that you achieve when you gain neutrality in energy, but it doesn't talk about resources at all. So this is like this very much a intermediate target, and it's very much middle of the journey. And I would call this basically the start of the journey rather than where a corporate could be in a few years' time. So if you actually think of the next steps that it can go to be restorative is to be doing things to nature to restore to where it was. Reconciliatory is reintegrating humans as integral parts of nature, and regenerating is designing with nature. So when we become regenerative, we create a very healthy equilibrium with nature, where material flows are in equilibrium and it does not degenerate the environment. And that's the status that corporates can actually achieve as a long-term sustainability vision. I'm moving to the next part. Alrighty, coming to a bit more detail with the next two sections, I think. So product design and product evaluation, how does it change with the emergence of circular economy? So if we think of how the products are perceived in the industrial era specifically, the typical production basically tries to optimize a few basic things. So there's a focus on efficiency in production. There's emphasis on optimizing product performance, cost, as well as aesthetics. The framework that Michael Braungart and William McDonough proposed in Cradle to Cradle, they talk about a different criteria. They talk about ecology, economy, and equity. So ecology is about increased environmental consciousness or awareness and fulfilling the environmental criteria. Economies is about being cost competitive still with the production. Equity is about being able to redistribute better to reduce the gaps between haves and have-nots, and at the same time respecting diversity. So they talked about eco-effectiveness as a criteria as opposed to efficiency. Now their concept broadened, and they took it to the next level. It's they have their Cradle to Cradle Product Innovation Institute, which gives Cradle to Cradle certifications for products, where they evaluate products using 5 different criteria. They have, the first one is material health, which means the material is free of toxicity. It's able to be handled by people when it's post-consumption. There's the aspect of material reutilization, which is regeneration, is given consideration. Use of renewable energy, how effectively it manages water, and how effectively it helps promote social fairness. So based on this criteria, there's product certifications happening through Cradle to Cradle Institute. The reason why I brought this up is, on one hand, to share this with you, but at the same time, to think about how product evaluation needs to change in light of principles of circular economy. So on one hand, the criteria that you usually use to evaluate products are going to change. It's like there are new dimensions being introduced, and then it's becoming more complex, and there's a need to have integrated assessments. So if you think of standalone criteria that we usually choose to evaluate a product, and then think of what techniques and tools we use. If we just do financial sort of analysis, we do activity-based costing, and if it's a material flow, we do material flow analysis or material flow cost accounting, a couple of techniques that we use. If it's standalone criteria as environment, there's carbon accounting, where we estimate the carbon footprint, or we can do life cycle assessment. For product performance, it can be tested technically as well as from the user point of view. So if you're testing it from the user point of view, you can adopt techniques like choice modeling. But the need is now more to test and evaluate products in a sort of a complex. When the evaluation becomes complex, the need is to basically incorporate them either together or separately, and evaluate them holistically. So some of the new things that I wouldn't say new, some of the specialized areas such as cost benefit analysis and multi-criteria decision analysis become very, very important in the new era of product evaluation, because there's on one hand there are multiple criteria, and their importance is consideration of them in the evaluation is also crucial, and the level of importance that you place on them is also different. So having this type of techniques would definitely be helpful for management accountants in getting ready for the transition to a circular economy. So I'll just quickly explain how they work. Very basic fundamentals in cost benefit analysis or multi-criteria decision analysis. We usually have apples and oranges, some very different numbers or figures with different units. So the apples could be carbon dioxide equivalent, Y could be mechanical strength of the material, and Z should be a monetary value. So in cost benefit analysis, what you do is to bring them to a common base by monetizing the parts that are not monetized. And then you think of an integration technique to get them together. In multi-criteria decision analysis, you kind of acknowledge them as different. You get apples as apples, oranges as oranges, and then you decide what are the criteria that I need to look at, what criteria is more important for me, and based on that, you use techniques like analytical hierarchy process, where you prioritize some criteria, and if apples are more crucial to you in your decision, you kind of favor the decision on apples, but you do it systematically, not basically neglecting others or not evaluating. You make a conscious decision, which is a calculated decision. This is an example that we have done on multi-criteria decision analysis. So the idea was to suggest a packaging material for beverages like beer, carbonated beverages. So we were evaluating plastic bottles, aluminum cans, and glass bottles. And we chose three main aspects: environmental factors, financial cost factors, and product performance. So environmental factors, we basically identify these criteria to evaluate the product: global warming potential, water consumption, and regenerative potential. Financial, in terms of financial and cost factors, material cost, manufacturing and recovery cost. Product performance, for this specific example of carbonated beverages, we had like a few technical properties, including permeability, rancidification, strength, etc. So this work is currently undergoing review for publication. And I'll have a bit of a more detailed example on cost benefit analysis. So this one is basically covering an industrial value chain rather than a product. So this was done basically for to identify whether an alternative was worth pursuing or worth promoting by the public sector. Sorry. So the as is, or the current practice, is that sorry, before that, this alternative is about basically using of recycled material in concrete. And the current way that we produce concrete is by using natural coarse aggregate, which looks like this. It's usually quarried and processed, and we add it to a few other components like fine aggregate, cement, cementitious material, water, undergoes cement ready mix concrete manufacturing process, and we have a product called natural aggregate concrete. And the to be, or the alternative that we considered, was the use of waste concrete, recycled waste concrete, not all the recycled waste concrete. When you subject waste concrete to a recycling process, it gets basically, I mean, crushed concrete is something like this. And if you separate the fine component and the coarse component of it, the coarse component, which is usually higher than 5 millimeters, looks like this. So instead of basically having natural aggregate used in cement, if you have recycled concrete aggregate, coarse aggregate replacing natural aggregate, how would that look like? So that was the alternative under consideration. So when we when this question was basically identified to study, there was a few realizations. So number one was that the recycled concrete aggregate is considered to have weaker qualities than natural aggregate. So as a material, it's not considered as a superior material, technically superior material to be in a cement mix. So is it a so does it mean that recycled aggregate concrete is actually inferior compared to natural aggregate? So is there a question about material performance? Then when the material is not similar, then you need to do other things like sieving, you need to clean it. So when you do additional processes to compensate some of the properties, does it become more expensive? The third aspect, in this picture, when you have, if you do additional processes, it also consumes energy. So is it environmentally sound? So is there a sort of a green proposition for recycled aggregate concrete as a product? So combining all this, because with a lot of these unknowns, do we have a strong case about use of recycled concrete aggregate in concrete, was the question asked. And there was also the observation there's low industry uptake for production, and there was a need to sort of drill down to the core of the problem and understand what it looks like. So what we have is a complex problem. It requires multiple criteria for evaluation, and it needs a representative result to compare the outcome. And this is a typical, I would say, management, accounting, and environmental economics challenge. And the criteria used was based on the principles of sustainability and financial viability of the end product. And there was a framework integrating all dimensions, and the methodology used was extended cost-benefit analysis. The reason why I say extended was there's a typical cost-benefit analysis methodology, and for this type of problems, that methodology sort of needed to be extended to cover some of the additional things that were not covered in previous work. And it basically gave a representative result as NPV for comparison. So what we have is different criteria, and there was a need to bring all the criteria together to come up with one representative outcome. So the NPV here, calculated here, is actually not the typical financial NPV. It's an economic indicator. It's not purely a financial indicator. It's the difference between that and the typical NPV that we use in financial analysis. So for financial analysis, we talk about profit, which is revenue minus costs. If we extend it to economic analysis, we want to consider the net benefit on society as an additional factor. So it becomes net benefit, which is benefits minus costs. So some of the times benefits are not monetized, and you got to monetize them to basically integrate with costs. And the principal stakeholder is society and public, whereas in financial analysis, the stakeholder is usually a single party that you do the evaluation for. And economic analysis captures externalities, which are not monetized, such as pollution due to CO2 emissions, whereas financial analysis only captures the internalized items, which are items where there's already a price assigned for. So the NPV that was calculated here was the financial cost or cost saving with the alternative, plus the total external cost or benefit to society, which means what in the current pricing system, what is the financial cost? If you have prices for externalities in the system, then how would the price change in that context? So that was the NPV. That was what the NPV calculated there. So this is interesting to note what happens in here. In financial analysis, in a typical alternative evaluation like that, if the cost of recycled aggregate concrete is higher, then the commercial sector would not produce it because it's unprofitable to produce it. But on the other hand, if the economic analysis says that the net benefit associated with recycled aggregate concrete is higher, then the society benefits with its production. So to initiate production, there's a need to create incentives and disincentives, and then pass it to kickstart the initiative. And that is usually a task done by the public sector, the government. So we wanted to find out whether this was the case. And these are the summarized results of the study. I don't want to go into detail. Financial analysis suggested that it's expensive to produce. The reason why you see two percentages here was that there were approximately 42 scenarios evaluated, and for each of the scenarios, the material mixes were different, the distribution methods were different, the product properties were different. So the typical analysis basically covered all those 42 scenarios. So this result is basically summarizing that. So at 30% replacement of recycled concrete aggregate in structural concrete, it was expensive to manufacture. The embodied energy analysis suggested that sometimes it's lower, sometimes it's higher, and there's no distinctive environmental advantage because the processors were having similar amounts of emissions. When the effect of not extracting natural aggregate and the effect of diverting concrete waste out of landfill was considered, it gave the natural aggregate concrete the bad picture. So basically, recycled aggregate concrete, the external cost became positive. When you take into account the avoided extraction and avoided waste sent to landfill. Finally, the initiative as a whole gave positive NP for recycled aggregate concrete as opposed to natural aggregate concrete. So this is a sort of a more complex and comprehensive example. How it matters in a circular economy is that not all the alternatives sometimes are market competitive, or they cannot run basically on a automatic market mechanism, and some of them need government intervention. For example, from the results of the previous study that I told you, the role of the government is to basically have the carrot and stick mechanism to basically kickstart the activities in the value chain. But what the study did was to uncover and make the costs and benefits in the whole industrial value chain more transparent. So if you, for example, apply tax on natural aggregate quarrying, tax the landfill, put subsidies on recycling, and provide incentives for adoption of recycled concrete, and also create the pull by encouraging buildings with recycled material, that's the way to sort of kickstart an initiative like that. So the initial power for decision making comes with that information orientation that comes through analysis of numbers. So this study was published in 6 papers and 6 journal papers and book chapters, 1 book chapter. Alrighty, I'm just quickly going to cover the decisions covered in single dimensions. I would not discuss them in detail. I think a lot of you might know this because they're already in practice. For carbon accounting, we have scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We have life cycle assessment for carbon accounting, and material flow cost accounting for financial analysis. So I'll quickly, just browse through them just to let you know that they're there if you're not familiar with them. But these practices are already, these techniques are already in practice by a lot of the management accountants. The last one that I'm going to is evaluation of alternative value chains. So here I don't have a very comprehensive example to share, but just to share an insight on how the industrial value chains will change and the effect that it'll have on management accounting practice. So with a circular economy, we have the need to recover the waste materials. I mean, especially when we are in transition, waste materials, and divert it back to manufacturing value chains. So the waste generator then becomes a resource donor, and the manufacturing industry, the industry who using the material, becomes a resource recipient. Sometimes it goes directly, sometimes it needs a converting industry, such as recycler, cleaner, blender, or whoever. So this is the industry basically gets this waste material, modifies it, and supplies it to this resource recipient, who's a manufacturing industry. Now, this introduces a lot of variability and complexity into value chains. On one hand, when we have extracted material, they are usually more uniform, they are predictable, and the standard manufacturing processes are designed to handle them in a certain way. But when you start using a waste material, their composition is different, the volume or the supply would be different. So there's a need to have more quality control and volume control, or measures to avoid variability in those. But a typical manufacturing company who gets such a product and uses that in their production also faces another dimension of variability, which is coming from the market. Now, the new products that they manufacture and produce have recycled material in their products. So they have to deal with the market perception, different value proposition of products used in containing recycled material, variability in sales volume, and all that. So when you think of the typical industrial value chain, the complexity that it will have with as well as the variability, there's a need to use a more sort of dynamic modeling and techniques such as Monte Carlo simulation. So you basically, this variability is too high to capture it as a number. So you probably might need to use it, to see the variability through a probabilistic distribution. And this type of complex techniques are increasingly sort of required when these situations arise. So I am coming to the end of the presentation. Just to summarize of what I told and a few more thoughts. I talked about transition to a circular economy. The need why it is being done is to, on one hand, to create competitive advantage for businesses. The fact that reduce the risk on natural resources, dependency on natural resources, as well as to remove the barriers from the market side with consumption leading to sort of a dead end. There's a need to have a systematic approach when we approach transition. It's not something one person or one entity can do. It requires collaboration. A lot of these alternatives sometimes require industry collaboration, or sometimes inter-industry or intra-industry collaboration. As professionals, there's a need to have multidisciplinary skills built within to some of the professional practices, as well as there's a need to have specialized expertise on some areas. And on the other hand, there's a need to have sustainability leadership in organizations, but that's not enough. There's a need to have frontline business leaders being equipped with knowledge and making decisions accordingly. And working with data and information is crucial. So just to end it, the organization that I'm working for is basically facilitating the process. And if you want to contact me, these are my contact details, and I think you'll have a shared copy of the presentation. With that, I end, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much, Mayuri. Excellent presentation, very detailed in some areas. Now there is two questions asked by Monash Academic, which is a bit detailed. So before I get to you answering those questions, I just have a few observations myself. One is, I like your example about Philips, and that you said they want light and not a bulb. But actually, I know that you have a background in marketing as well. The Theodore Levitt, the founder of marketing, said people don't want a quarter-inch drill; they want a quarter-inch hole. So that between light and bulb and a drill and a hole is something even marketing staff talks about. So I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
Now, the one interesting thing that you mentioned, which I'm not very sure of, is this whole idea of celebrating use. You said something that we should use more and therefore recycle it back into the economy, sort of, if I've understood it properly. But what about the at least 10 to 30% waste? In every cycle, there would be some amount of waste, and when millions of people start doing this, the waste generation could be quite significant, as we know, and you and I have discussed this with the plastic bottles. You gave a plastic bottles example, and the waste is litter. I mean, that is there. So one area that I didn't see coming up is this whole idea of convenience of carrying water around versus the litter. So I just thought I'll sort of make those observations. Maybe you'll have some views about that, and then we can get down to the questions and answers asked by others.
Yeah, sure. I mean, when I sort of introduced the concept of circular economy, if we being where we are now, if we think of an ideal world, which is basically completely regenerative. So the way that Michael Braungart and William McDonough visualized it, it's a world where consumption is not a problem because everything is designed to be perfectly regenerative. Now, being from where we are and going there is like a really steep hill. And I mean, in the middle, if you kind of think of alternative or other intermediary outcomes, sometimes there's this question about having not a circular economy, but what we call a chain economy. It's exactly what you said. We have some extraction of resources, but we have some emission of waste. So if you think of going from realism to the ultimate vision, there are a lot of intermediate sort of milestones, and I guess we also deal with the I mean, for some things, we deal with the limitations in design, limitations coming from existing consumer behavior, limitations coming from political and leadership. So there's a lot of challenges and variability that affects the entire journey.
Thank you, Mayuri. Actually, you mentioned political, and that gives me a chance of one other comment. You said that the government must step in and do all this, give us incentives and so on. But if you look at our current Australian government, okay, as you know, there's lots of views about even fossil fuels, and even electric cars, taxing electric cars and so on. So I can't see this government thing is not a sort of thing that doesn't have political views and differences of opinion. So that's another problem in this perfect world that you're talking about. Anyway, with that, can you look at the questions that have been asked? You can look at your questions and answer. There are two interesting questions asked by Christian. Can you see them?
Yes, I can see them.
Okay, maybe you can read them out, and then I can read them out and you can answer. What do you want to do?
I can read them out. So the question is about what is the role of accounting technologies in the development and implementation of circular economy initiatives by businesses and government? That is, what is the specific role of accountability, performance measurement, and other accounting principles, technologies, and more generally, how accounting might help in the transition to a circular economy? So as I mentioned, if I'm to sort of reword in a different way, when we think of transition to a circular economy, sometimes it's seen as a technical challenge, but actually, as a proposition, circular economy is not a is not an environmental proposition only. It has a sound environmental proposition, but it's also a business proposition, which means there's value in transition to a circular economy. And when we think of the actual transition, the transition can only happen when the economic processes change, which means how we produce, how we distribute, and how we consume things change. So which means there's a role for corporates is quite significant. We're thinking of basically having a very completely sort of a system change in how we do those three things. And taking that perspective of from a corporate perspective, if we think of the role of accountants as their contribution to decision making, their contribution to provide a sort of a reliable and accurate estimate of measuring performance, as well as providing information for managerial decision making. So that role itself is very, very significant. I mean, as you saw here, none of these alternatives actually can basically take off unless there's financial backing. And the financial backing is not a typical financial backing where you deal with numbers where there's already you can get a price. There are aspects that you deal with which are still qualitative, and you need to be able to measure them to bring them as a price to the decision making table. So I think that's where the role of accountants it needs the typical sort of a boundary, a professional practice boundary of an accountant, I think needs to expand to step into a bit more into the environmental economics and those areas if you are thinking of being a specialized decision maker in this area. But in general, in an organization, I think there's reliance on an accountant as a credible information producer, as an information orientator. So that role becomes very, very crucial, I think.
Okay.
I hope I answered the question.
There's a follow-up question as well, which I think you have sort of answered and give you an example, but you may wish to look at it again.
Alrighty. Is the proposed innovation related to the fact that MCDA is adopted in the realm of accounting in relation to the adopted approach specific context? It comes back to the weights and the subjectivity assigned to each factor. Yes, actually, yeah. I mean, if you're asking about the arena of decision sciences and how something like this is sort of the example that I showed on, I have shown on beer packaging evaluation, there could be subjectivity. Now, the question that we ask in a very uncertain area for decision making like this is that how do we make decisions? There's on one hand, there's no information, and on the other hand, we are trying to make the information, we're trying to make the situation a bit better by having information, but that information may not be the perfect information. So the way that I approach the problem is that having some information is better than having none. What you need to do is to have a systematic approach, have a sort of a rationale and a logic to how you make decisions, and the assumptions that you are unclear of, you need to increasingly validate them with more and more information. And probably, I mean, you do the first one as like the first iteration could be a very rough approximation. The second iteration, you add a new piece of research, you work with a specialized expert in that area. So you kind of, you increase the accuracy and the relevance, and you make the quality of your information enhance in multiple iterations. That's how you can remove the subjectivity, I think.
Okay. There's a question asked by Mohammed Hussein. Do you think by recycling economy mostly benefited ready-made garment? He wants to know if ready-made garments industry can benefit from the recycling economy.
Yeah, yeah. Just a quick insight about garment industry. They say the best garment is the one that is never made, because the garment industry is an industry where there's very little recycling and there's very little recycling potential as well. The way that you, I mean, if you're asking about whether recycling is an option for the garment industry, yes, it is. Having the economics or having more information about how beneficial recycling is to generate a new material for the next cycle of garment production, as well as for the finance, if you want to have it done, that is a good thing. But in general, the more sort of without going to the material level, if you can think of other mechanisms like sharing clothes, going for subscription models, reselling clothes, that sort of things are generally more effective to enhance the use of the length of use of clothes in use than going for material modification in the textile industry and garment industry.
Just to comment on that, there was an interesting video I saw recently with the head of Vogue India of the magazine talking about Mahatma Gandhi's fashion style, and basically he's talking about what you're saying. The problem is that there are hundreds and thousands of jobs. Okay, often getting payment like 50 cents for a garment that is marketers sell for style purposes at $200. It's going to be very difficult to get those people who buy the clothes at $200 to even share their clothes. I mean, after one wash, it's thrown out, one use, I should say. So it's that marketing part of it is going to be a very difficult model to break, okay, in this area. Okay, there's another question from Jonas, if you can see.
Yeah, there's one before that.
There's one before that. Yes, sorry.
Yeah. Can the world agree on strict manufacturing standards for the waste ratio in each industry? Look, each industry has different challenges. Now, for example, based on the industry, if it's a building materials industry, it produces a completely different set of materials, completely different set of waste types. I am not sure whether agreeing on a certain waste ratio is a sort of a, it might work as a blanket model. But on the other hand, each industry has potential to um, design for regeneration at a in the upstream, which means when you produce and when you distribute. So the exploring that potential might be a good idea rather than to put a technical limitation, because that is also governed by the material itself, which is basically out of control by the industry sometimes. And going to Jonas's question, there appears to have a strong government as an enabler for this transition. Definitely. The example you have on page 39 dealing with tax and tax subsidies to balance off the government benefits, etc. Can you explain the role of government in the state of transition? Actually, government plays a very significant role in transition into circular economy. What I took was just one example where government can act as the regulator. Government can act as the party introducing pricing and market instruments to regulate the markets. Government also currently, for example, government in Victoria currently acts as a Sustainability Victoria has a very heavy emphasis on use of recycled material in products, and they basically have put themselves as a sort of a torchbearer by inducing public procurement. So introducing that to public procurement. So basically promoting use of recycled material and favoring that in public procurement is another area that currently being practiced. So the role of the government is actually, on one hand, it's acting as the protector of the environment. On the other hand, it acts as the controller who wants to avoid pollution and build up a pool of funds to subsidize or divert money into initiatives that proactively or reactively sort of help the environment. So that regulatory mechanisms as well as the policy instruments that a government can introduce actually play a very significant role in correcting the market, especially when the market mechanism is actually not favoring it. Do you think every kind of recycling affected our environment? I guess the question asked here is that I 100% don't understand the question. Maybe I'll give a general answer. I hope it covers it. Recycling is generally considered as a positive thing, but in a circular economy, as I mentioned to you, it has a lower priority. The reason is that when we do recycling, we usually try to produce a mixed material. And a mixed material is in value as well as in terms of use for another product is not the best. So if the idea of upcycling or recycling to produce a specific material is to avoid the disadvantage of having to deal with something that no one wanted, and which doesn't have the properties to go in and go to another product, and do it sort of in a very focused and a specified way, is to avoid this problem with having commodity mixed materials, which are which are generally the perception is that they're inferior and they are they don't have a specific use. So rather, that's the reason for promoting upcycling rather than recycling, so that the material that comes out of it already is valuable and ready to be used.
Okay, thank you. Mayuri, we are running out of times as well, so I'll just make a final a comment. I liked your example about, I think you called it analytical hierarchical processes. That alone scares most of our management accountants who can't get beyond adding one and one. But essentially, I think in a simpler way, if you can use subjectivity in this area, I would say it is a weights and rates system. Certain ideas have a higher weightage than other things, and then each project is rated accordingly, and then you come up with a score at the end. So, in fact, I'm developing some sort of scorecard in that way, and I would like to get your views. But I think this sounds very interesting, but looks like you need an engineering background to understand how to do it. But I must look into it more carefully. Thank you for that. Any other questions? I think we are coming to the end. Marit, thank you very much for your time. Uh, Beautiful slides and very well explained. There are some people who are wanting the slides, but I said that they'll be available via the recording that will be posted to on the website as well as sent to everyone who has registered. Okay, and you may wish to contact Mayuri with her contact details there, and she may wish to talk to you further. But other than that, thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. I personally, though I'm in this area, have got a very better insight into the circular economy. So thank you very much, Mayuri, for that.
You're welcome. Most welcome. Thanks, Janik. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for having me in the session. Thank you to everybody for attending.
Thank you. Thank you very much.